It's a great pleasure to have Mark Windsor from the New College of the Humanities in London, who will be talking to us today about the miraculous and the uncanny. Please, Mark.
Thank you, Filippo. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I thought I'd just say a little bit about my interest in this topic and how that interest came about and how it situates in my existing research. So really my interest in the miraculous came about via my interest in the uncanny. So my PhD research, which I finished up quite a few years ago, was on the topic of the uncanny. And really my main motivation for investigating the uncanny came from its application in art and in aesthetics. So the link to the miraculous is something that I didn't investigate much at the time, but it's been in the back of my mind. It's been something I've wanted to investigate because it strikes me that there's a really, really strong link between the kinds of phenomena that we call uncanny and the kinds of phenomena that people can call miraculous. So I want to kind of dig down into that relationship between these phenomena in this talk. So I'm still not entirely sure exactly where this is going to go, this topic. So I'm really curious to hear people's thoughts in discussion, any suggestions. Okay, so let's get going. So I mentioned that my main interest in the uncanny came via an interest in art and aesthetics. So I'm going to begin this talk with some examples, which I hope will effectively introduce the kind of relationship between these phenomena that I'm interested in. And the first example is an excerpt from a short story, a great short story by Dickens. So it's a kind of a spooky story to be read at dusk. So the opening, the setup of the story is that there's a traveler and he's in Switzerland, and it's dusk, the sun's setting, and he's outside his accommodation, and he observes and then overhears 5 couriers sharing these stories. And this is how the story begins. So, thunder and lightning, said the German, warming. When a certain man is coming to see you unexpectedly and without his own knowledge sends some invisible messenger to put the idea of him into your head all day, what do you call that? When you walk along a crowded street at Frankfurt, Milan, London, Paris, and think that a passing stranger is like your friend Heinrich, and then that another passing stranger is like your friend Heinrich, and so begin to have a strange foreknowledge that presently you'll meet your friend Heinrich. What do you do, which you do, though you believed him at Trieste? What do you call that? So you get the idea that this German, one of the couriers, is recounting these kind of odd tales. And he goes on. So one of his companions, a Swiss courier, murmurs under his breath here, it's not that uncommon, these occurrences, to which the German replies, uncommon, it's as common as cherries in the Black Forest. It's as common as macaroni at Naples. And Naples reminds me, when the old Marchesa Senzanima shrieks at a card party on the Caiaia, as I heard and saw her, for it happened in a Bavarian family of mine, and I was overlooking the service that evening. I say, when the old Marchesa starts up at the card table, white through her rouge, and cries, my sister in Spain is dead, and I felt her cold touch on my back. And when that sister is dead at the moment, what do you call that? Or when the blood of San Girano liquefies at the request of the clergy, as all the world knows that it does regularly once a year in my native city, said the Neapolitan courier, after a pause with a comical look. What do you call that? That, cried the German. Well, I think I know the name for that. Miracle, said the Neapolitan, with the same sly face. The German merely smoked and laughed, and they all smoked and laughed. Bah, said the German presently. I speak of things that really do happen. So that's my first example, hopefully a kind of amusing case to illustrate. And here is the blood of San Giovanni. I'm not sure, Filippo, is this something you're aware of? Is this well known? He's nodding. So according to the internet, the blood liquefies 3 times a year, not once a year, as Dickens claims. Here's a photo of Pope Francis blessing the blood in 2015. And it's reported that recently, so last December, I believe, the blood failed to liquefy, which caused tremors across Naples and perhaps beyond, people fearing that this could be a terrible omen. This is truly a bizarre thing. I didn't know this until I read Dickens's story. So there you go. So here's another example of a miraculous phenomenon, the Weeping Madonna of Syracuse, Italy. So this is a city in Sicily, I believe. I believe it is the one case of a weeping statue which has been officially verified by the church. So it's an official miracle. Most cases of weeping and crying statues are unofficial, and many have been explicitly denied by the church. So this is the story. It's a plaster. It's a cheap, mass-produced plaster bust or plaque of the Virgin Mary. And it was given as a wedding gift to a couple. So Antonina and Angelo Iannuso. Hopefully the pronunciation is acceptable. So the story is that Antonina became pregnant, but then also became gravely ill, sadly, upon becoming pregnant. And then this is the story I found on the internet. At 3 in the morning on Saturday, August 29th, 1953, Antonina suffered a seizure that left her blind. By 8:30 that morning, her sight was restored. When she was able to see, her eyes were on the Madonna, which, to Antonina's amazement, was weeping effusive tears. So this was investigated strenuously. The priests and bishops were brought in to examine the statue, and it was they accepted that this really was a miraculous event. And so the Pope Pius XII, in a radio broadcast, acknowledged the reality of the miracle. He says, "We acknowledge the unanimous declaration of the Episcopal Conference held in Sicily on the reality of the event. But will men understand the mysterious language of those tears?" He adds rather enigmatically. So my source here, I don't know how reliable this is. It's from a kind of Catholic tradition website. So these examples, I hope, serve to give a kind of a flavor of the kinds of phenomena that I'm interested in, which I'm calling the miraculous and the uncanny. Now, the concept of a miracle, I suppose, is quite a familiar one, so I probably don't need to say much about it, but here's just a few little points about what the concept of a miracle is. So, etymologically speaking, by definition, a miracle is an object of wonder. So it comes from the Latin miraculum, which in turn derives from mirari, which means to wonder. Here's an early theological source, Thomas Aquinas, describing miracles. So Aquinas writes that things that are divinely accomplished apart from the established order in things are customarily called miracles. And then Aquinas goes on to identify this emotion of wonder with the miraculous. So he says that a thing that has a completely hidden cause is wondrous in an unqualified way. And this, the name miracle suggests, namely what is of itself filled with admirable wonder. So let me now say something about the concept of the uncanny. And this is before I really begin my theoretical investigation into the uncanny. So just to say something about the concept. Now, I'm guessing that the concept may be less familiar to people than that of miracles in the miraculous. So it's going to be especially valuable for me to just offer some remarks. So here's the Oxford English Dictionary. It lists various different senses of the word, but this is the one that's most relevant for us here, which is partaking of a supernatural character, mysterious, weird, uncomfortably strange, or unfamiliar. And this usage became common around the mid-19th century. But it's basically impossible to talk about the uncanny without talking about Freud. And I will be saying more about Freud in the course of the talk. There's a really strong association between the uncanny and this essay that Freud wrote on the uncanny. Now, in German, the title is Das Unheimlich, which literally means the unhomely. So the German word unheimlich, unhomely, is translated in English as uncanny, because presumably the sense of uncanny more neatly captures what the sense of unheimlich is doing in this context. So Freud opens his essay by observing that the uncanny is undoubtedly related to what is frightening, to what arouses dread and horror. And in the essay, Freud aims to specify what is peculiar about these things that we call uncanny, such that they elicit this peculiar kind of dread and horror. So I'm going to come back to this in what follows, but this is just to, I hope, clarify the kind of thing, the kind of phenomena that I'm talking about. So here's a list of paradigmatic uncanny phenomena. So waxwork figures, automata, and dolls. So there's a subfield of research, or a field of research, into a kind of phenomenon that's called the uncanny valley, which specifically concerns very highly lifelike human lifelike figures. So human lifelike figures which are too lifelike, and we get this kind of creepy effect from them. But there are all sorts of other phenomena which can be described as uncanny. So things like unlikely coincidences. So we had some kind of examples of that with the excerpt from Dickens. Freud gives an example of it repeatedly encountering the same number during the day. So imagine if you get on a bus and your ticket has number 73 written on it, and then you go to the cinema and you're in seat 73, and so on. Doppelgangers is a recurrent uncanny trope in art and literature. Or, these kind of weird stories. Ghosts and haunted houses. So think of, for example, Edgar Allan Poe's Fall of the House of Usher. And then also psychic phenomena. So things like telepathy or telekinesis. So the final thing to note about this before I move on is that uncanny as a word in its standard kind of English usage describes a property of objects or events, but it's also used to describe a kind of feeling. So there's a peculiarity in the word, which is it spans both objects and the feeling aroused by objects, similar to the sublime, we might think. So we can speak here of an uncanny feeling. So this is what I'm going to try and explain in this talk. This observation that the same phenomena...
Sorry, can I interrupt you?
Yeah, of course.
I love everything so far. I just want... what is the etymological origin of uncanny? Because I think it might be useful because the miraculous you said and the uncanny.
Oh yeah, good. Thank you. So, I know that it comes from Scottish. It's originally a Scottish and a Northern word, and it would normally refer to a kind of a person who was in some way dangerous or disturbing. I mean, it's really a conjunction of canny, which means kind of cunning or knowing. So if I'm a canny poker player, then it means I'm good at bluffing people, that kind of thing. So it actually uncanny suggests something similar to unhomely. It suggests something which is hidden. So there is quite a close parallel between uncanny and unhomely. I have done a while investigating the origin, the etymology of uncanny, and it's a little bit messy, and there's quite a bit of uncertainty, it seems. Interestingly, the first few pages of Freud's essay are an etymological investigation into the word Heimlich and unheimlich. Yeah, does that help? Sorry, I can't give a more concrete answer on uncanny. So this is what I want to explain, is that it seems like the same phenomena. So for example, crying statue, this is my central example, could be described as miraculous, but it could also be experienced as something uncanny, something kind of strange and unnerving. But even though the same phenomena might be experienced or described as miraculous or uncanny, the emotions associated with these phenomena it seems, are importantly different. So we've already seen that miracles are associated with wonder, and we've also seen how Freud located the uncanny with negative emotions of fear and dread. I mean, other ways we could cash out the uncanny is in terms of what is eerie, creepy, and weird. So it seems like there's this relationship between the miraculous and the uncanny, but also an important difference. And that's really what I want to try and clarify in this talk. What distinguishes the experiences of the miraculous and the uncanny, and also what's the relationship between these. Now, I should emphasize here that I'm really interested in the experience of these phenomena. So I'm not really interested in committing to the reality of miracles or taking a stand on the possibility of miracles, although that is an issue that almost inevitably will crop up, as you'll see. But just to emphasize here that it's really the experience that I'm interested in. Now, I'm going to consider a possible objection to the phenomena I'm seeking to explain. So I said that there's this important distinction between this important difference between the emotions associated with uncanny phenomena and those associated with miracles. Well, one might suspect that actually there isn't such a difference between these things. So the word uncanny does crop up in theological writings. So in particular, Rudolf Otto, a German theologian, has this well-known book called The Idea of the Holy. And in this book, he aims to give an account of the origin and the essence of religion as a kind of feeling, as a kind of emotion. And he describes this feeling as the feeling of the numinous. So he's developing here, taking here from the Latin word numen, which means spirit or divine power. And he thinks that this feeling is a qualitatively unique state of mind, right? So it's a sui generis state of mind, which he thinks is the essence of religion. Now, we'll see why this is of interest momentarily. So Otto analyzes, he tries to get at this numinous, this experience of the numinous, in terms of what he calls mysterium tremendum. So mysterium referring to what is hidden and occult, and tremendum referring to a kind of dread, but Otto says not to be mistaken for any ordinary dread. Which is interesting because actually this is much what Freud says at the beginning of his investigation into the uncanny. It's like we're interested in dread, but not any old dread. So Otto describes religious feelings of what is tremendum in this way. He talks about religious dread or awe, so he's treating these as synonymous. And he goes on to describe how the antecedent stage of this religious dread is daemonic dread. And then he identifies a queer perversion of this, which is a kind of abortive offshoot, the dread of ghosts. So he writes, it first begins to stir in the feeling of something uncanny, eerie, or weird. It is this feeling which, emerging in the mind of primeval man, forms the starting point for the entire religious development in history. Well, if this is true, then there isn't really an important or meaningful distinction between, it seems, between the miraculous and the uncanny. But I want to push back on this. In other words, I don't accept Otto's description here. I mean, possibly we're just using the word uncanny in slightly different senses, although the fact that he says eerie, weird, and also relates it to ghosts suggests really quite strongly that he's getting at the same phenomenon that Freud is. Anyway, this is the main reason why it doesn't seem to me that this uncanny feeling can plausibly be located as the root of religion, right? And that is that we get this feeling in relation to phenomena which it seems don't have anything to do with religion. So think about, waxworks, dolls, automata. And this brings me really to where my interest in the uncanny originated, which is to understand this peculiar kind of feeling which is exploited in works of art, visual art, and literature. This is still here from Ex Machina, a great film. So this is what I'm going to try to do for the remainder of the talk. I want to try and tease apart these religious feelings that we have in relation to what is miraculous, so the kind of wonder or the kind of awe or dread that Otto locates as a kind of religious feeling, from this feeling of something uncanny, as Otto puts it. So against Otto, I think we can tease these apart. And I think the best way of doing this will be to distinguish these emotions as having distinctive formal objects. This is a phrase that comes from Anthony Kenny and has been kind of taken up into the literature on emotion. So the formal object is the description under which some particular object must be subsumed in order to have a given emotion towards the object. So the stock example is that fear is directed at something which is dangerous, right? So some particular object has to be subsumed under the category of the dangerous in order to feel fear towards it. So I think something similar a similar account can be developed for these emotional responses towards the miraculous and the uncanny. So in other words, there's a distinctive kind of cognitive appraisal involved in each one. So that's what I'm going to try and grasp hold of. So in a summary, in a nutshell, these are the claims I'm going to try to defend. These are the key points, I think, that distinguish these experiences. So firstly, this is what miracles, the miraculous and the uncanny, have in common. They both involve an experience of an apparent impossibility. But where they come apart primarily, or in the first place, is in terms of the subject's background beliefs about what is possible. So to experience something as miraculous requires belief in the existence of the supernatural and the possibility of its interaction or interference in the natural order. So to experience some apparent impossibility as miraculous requires that it be interpreted in a religious context and causally attributed to a supernatural being. On the other hand, to experience some apparent impossibility as uncanny, I claim, requires an attitude of disbelief, or at least skepticism, toward the phenomenon, the apparent impossibility. And the apparent impossibility must cause uncertainty about what is real. So I'll spell this out in more detail as we go along, but these are the key points. So what they share in common is they both involve the appearance of the impossible, but where they come apart in particular is with regards to belief in the supernatural. So let's pick up on miracles first. So I'm going to do a kind kind of whistle-stop tour, if you like, of early modern philosophers on miracles. And from this we'll extrapolate an account of what a miracle is. So John Earman, who's written on Hume's account of miracles, makes this helpful distinction between what he calls epistemic and ontic conceptions of miracles. To put this another way would be to say, well, epistemic conceptions of miracles define miracles from kind of the subject's point of view, whereas ontic are more interested in the miracle as an objective phenomenon. So here's two examples of what Earman calls epistemic conceptions. Firstly, Spinoza has a chapter of miracles in his theological political treatise. And Spinoza writes that men are accustomed to call divine or the work of God anything of which the cause is not generally known. Now, what's interesting about Spinoza's account of miracles is that he actually argues that there just simply cannot be any miracles. So as you may know, Spinoza is a materialist and determinist. So in his view, there just simply is nature and nothing can operate outside of the order of nature. But he is also a theist, right? So he believes in God, but he just identifies God with everything. So hence he's a pantheist. I mean, this is just interesting. I mean, I guess this is slightly parenthetical to my main, to what I'm trying to show here, but I think it's interesting. Is that, you know, you can be a theist and also just simply deny the possibility of miracles, such as Spinoza does. Here's another so-called epistemic conception of miracles, and this one is from John Locke, who published this pamphlet, Discourse of Miracles. So Locke writes that a miracle I take to be a sensible operation which, being above the comprehension of the spectator and in his opinion contrary to the established course of nature, is taken by him to be divine. Now, this is getting me closer to what I'm looking for here, this notion of contrary to the established course of nature. I mean, again, somewhat as an aside, theologians generally aren't happy with these epistemic conceptions of miracles, because it looks like on these conceptions, miracles can't really provide any evidence for any kind of religion, which, generally speaking, theologically minded people want miracles to do, right? Miracles can actually show us something, provide evidence of something. Locke considers this and says, well, this is not really a problem. You know, this is the best you're going to get. Anyway, so probably the best known philosophical discussion of miracles is that of David Hume. So, as many of you will know, I'm sure, section 10 of his inquiry concerning human understanding of miracles has become almost infamous, right? I read one commentator who claims that of all the sections of the first inquiry, this one has generated the most debates, the most heated debates. Now, thankfully, I need not delve into much of the contention surrounding this chapter, this section of the inquiry. But what I can just flag up is that there are really two key sets of issues that the discussion of Hume's essay concerns. Firstly, the nature of miracles, which is what I'm really interested in here. And secondly, the evidence for miracles. That really was Hume's main aim in the essay, was to show that there can never be sufficient testimony to establish evidence for a miracle. I can just put that issue aside. What I'm interested in here is what Hume has to say about what a miracle is. And he offers two definitions in section 10 of the inquiry. So first, in the main body of the text, he defines a miracle quite simply as a violation of the laws of nature. He then offers a second definition, which appears in a rambling footnote, where he repeats the first definition, but then adds a second clause to it. So in this second definition, he writes that a miracle may be more accurately defined, a transgression of a law of nature by a particular volition of the deity or by the interposition of some invisible agent. So it's obvious what he means by the deity. Some room for confusion about what he's getting at with invisible agents. Perhaps he means angels. So there was a debate previously, theological debate, about whether angels could bring about miracles or whether it was only God. Perhaps that's what he means. In any case, I think we can probably just disregard the invisible agents. So I think Hume's definition is helpful. This is kind of getting me towards what I want to draw out my comparison between the miraculous and the uncanny. I think this will help understand the relationship between these two things, and in particular this idea of a transgression of a law of nature brought about by deity. Now, there's one major concern with Hume's definition of miracles, which is whether it's even coherent, right? So several commentators have thought that Hume's definition effectively rules miracles out of existence. So you have some apparent impossibility, right? Some event that happens that appears to contradict a law of nature. Well, it seems that either the event happened, in which case it's falsified the law of nature, right? It wasn't in fact a law of nature, or the event as described can't have happened, right? You can't simultaneously have some event that violates the law of nature, which really happens, and it also be a violation of that law of nature. So this is something that Anthony Flew, Alistair MacKinnon, and others have raised as an issue. Now, if this is the case, why did Hume go to all this trouble of trying to show that the testimony for miracles is never enough, when actually he's just defined miracles in a way that it just follows that they can't happen. So Hume's definition of miracles is such that miracles are physical impossibilities, but as Anthony Flew points out, the criterion of physical as opposed to logical impossibility simply is logical incompatibility with the law of nature. So in other words, it follows from the definition that miracles are logically impossible, right? Now, this is a bit of a problem, at least for anyone that wants to endorse this definition and also maintain that miracles could happen. It looks like there may be a way out. So the religious studies scholar Ninian Smart has given a discussion which tackles this issue, and Smart suggests that a negative instance to a law of nature requires not a single event but a repeatable event. So Smart is highlighting basically the way science is practiced, right? Which is to say that if we were empirically investigating some operation of the laws of nature, and you observe a single event which appears to contradict the law, you wouldn't rule out the law of nature until you'd repeated the event under similar circumstances, right? So the event has to be repeatable in order to contradict the law of nature. So Richard Swinburne, who's a philosopher and a theologian, develops Smart's proposal and argues that a law of nature is logically compatible with the occurrence of an exception to its operation. So if this view is right, and I'm sure there's room for pushback on this, then a violation of a law of nature can be coherently understood as a non-repeatable counter-instance to a law of nature. Now, thankfully, I don't need to really commit myself to this because I'm interested in what it is to experience a miracle, right? Which is to say, I'm not committing to the possibility or the reality of miracles. Nevertheless, it would seem preferable, given that I'm trying to characterize the experience in terms of the objects the formal object of the experience. It would seem preferable if I characterize that in a way that's, you know, at least coherent, or at least possible. So I'm gonna pick up and run with this characterization of miracles. So we can have these non-repeatable exceptions to laws of nature, but of course not any non-repeatable exception to a law of nature will be miraculous. As Smart points out, miracles are inexplicable to us, but not all events inexplicable to us are miracles. So miracles must have some divine origin, right? So in other words, the event must be causally attributed to some divine, some supernatural being, right? So in other words, we do need that second clause in Hume's second definition. So developing from Hume, I'm going to offer this provisional definition of a miracle as a violation of the natural order, which is to say a physical impossibility that is causally attributed to a supernatural being. So this gives me a way of characterizing the kind of wonder that characterizes the experience of the miraculous. It's a kind of wonder which is directed at an event that falls under this description. So it seemed, well, if this is right, or if something like this is right, then a major precondition for experiencing something as miraculous is belief in the supernatural realm, right, and the possibility of its interference in the natural order. Okay, so now let me turn to the uncanny. So I've said what I wanted to say about the miraculous. I may need to try and speed up slightly because I just realized what time it is. Okay, don't worry, okay. So I now want to draw out an account of what uncanny phenomena are, which I think makes quite clear what the parallel is and what the distinction is between miraculous and the uncanny. And to do this, I'm going to turn to Freud's account. So I said I'd turn back to Freud. And I think Freud has some really helpful things to say about the uncanny. So let me just introduce Freud's essay to you for any who are unfamiliar with him. So there's one major work on the uncanny that predates Freud's, and which Freud refers to in his essay. And it's only really gained recognition via Freud's essay, but in part Freud is responding to it. So it's by another German writer, Ernst Jentsch, on the psychology of the uncanny, and it was published about 15 years prior to Freud's. So in the essay, Jentsch identifies the uncanny feeling as a feeling of psychical uncertainty, and he emphasizes that this arises in relation to things that are new and unfamiliar. Now, Freud thinks Jentsch misses something here. So Freud thinks that the uncanny is less to do merely with only with what is unfamiliar than with what involves some kind of ambivalence or commingling of the familiar and the unfamiliar, or the homely and the unhomely. So Freud gets to this ambivalence via an etymological investigation into the German word heimlich, homely. And this has led to what I'm going to call Freud's basic definition of the uncanny, which is a kind of an anxiety, a kind of feeling of being unsettled or perturbed that is caused by something that is both strange and familiar. Now, that's not all Freud had to say about the uncanny, and it's probably not really appropriate to even call this a definition. It's more of just a loose characterization. Surely there are many things which are strange and familiar, which we don't experience as uncanny. In fact, it's a recurrent theme in art and aesthetics that artists are making the ordinary extraordinary, or the everyday, extraordinary in some way, but oftentimes none of this has anything to do with this peculiar feeling of dread that we call the uncanny. So we need to push further. So Freud does push further, and he offers this psychoanalytic theory of the uncanny, which is most often referred to in the literature, and this is the return of the repressed. So more specifically, the return of repressed infantile sexual complexes. So oftentimes Freud's theory of the uncanny just simply is identified with the return of the repressed, and it's forgivable that, you know, that people might come to that conclusion, because actually for the most part in the essay, Freud does present his theory of the uncanny as simply being the return of the repressed. So even late on in the third and final section, he writes, "It may be true that the uncanny is something which is secretly familiar, which has undergone repression and then returned from it. And everything that is uncanny fulfills this condition." This is what he writes. But he then goes on, very shortly after this, then goes on to actually distinguish this other explanation of the uncanny. And it's that other explanation that I think is much more valuable for understanding what is peculiar about uncanny phenomena. So I've discussed this at length elsewhere, so I'm just going to skip over it basically. I don't think the return of the repressed helps. I think we should just get rid of it. But I have explained the reasons why elsewhere, so I'm not being rash here. So let me turn to the other explanation that he offers. And this other explanation, it has a less catchy name. The other explanation is the apparent confirmation of surmounted primitive beliefs. So let me just say a bit about what this theoretical explanation is. So what are surmounted primitive beliefs? Well, for Freud, these are beliefs in magical and animistic phenomena. So he describes, so in this other work, this kind of work of anthropology almost, Totem and Taboo, he describes how human society goes through these stages of development, and he describes these early stages of development in terms of magic and animism. So animism being the belief that everything possesses a kind of spirit or soul. Magical phenomena can be thought of in terms of what Freud calls the omnipotence of thoughts, right? So the idea that thoughts can have kind of direct causal effects in reality without mediation. Also the idea that the dead can return to the living, right? That people live on after death. So these are the kinds of beliefs that he describes as primitive. And he thinks that all of us once held these beliefs, so both on a societal level in the distant past, but also on an individual level. So he thinks that as children, we tended to hold these primitive beliefs, but then as we grow older, we surmount them. So these beliefs have been surmounted both collectively on a societal level and individually. So Freud writes that nowadays we no longer believe in these primitive phenomena. We have surmounted these modes of thought, but we do not feel quite sure of our new beliefs, and the old ones still exist within us, ready to seize upon any confirmation. As soon as something actually happens in our lives which seems to confirm the old discarded beliefs, we get a feeling of the uncanny. So I think this theory is valuable for helping us understand what is peculiar about uncanny phenomena, about the experience of the uncanny. And I think there are two features in particular of the account which are really valuable. So the first key feature is that for something to be experienced as uncanny on this account, it must be experienced as real, right? So as Freud puts it, something that actually happens in our lives. The second key feature is that it must bring about uncertainty. So Freud makes this explicit when he goes on to discuss its application to fiction. And he writes there that this feeling of the uncanny cannot arise unless there is a conflict of judgment as to whether things which have been surmounted and are regarded as incredible may not, after all, be possible. The problem, however, with this theory of Freud's is that these categories of surmounted beliefs and primitive beliefs are problematic, right? So I mean, this probably hasn't escaped your attention already that, you know, this talking about these primitive beliefs, these magical and animistic beliefs. I mean, it just kind of jars with our sensibilities, but more substantially than that, it's not well. These observations of Freud are not well founded either. So he draws on quite dubious anthropology, 19th century anthropology, in characterizing the beliefs of so-called primitive peoples. From a developmental psychology point of view, it's not so clear that as children that we hold these beliefs. And moreover, it's not really clear how this mechanism of surmounting these beliefs is supposed to happen. In short, these categories are problematic, right? So I think we can overcome these problems, and that's what I want to do in my definition of the uncanny, which I've developed. Another objection you might have here is that, well, is it really necessary that one must have first held some belief in a phenomena and then surmounted that belief in order to experience the phenomena as uncanny, right? So what if I just never believed in ghosts? Does that mean ghosts, can't be uncanny to me? This question doesn't quite seem plausible. In any case, here is the definition of the uncanny that I offer. So developing these two key features from Freud's account. It's worth observing here that Freud was really interested in developing a genetic account of the uncanny, but this is what I'm offering is more of an analysis of what the uncanny is, and I hope it overcomes the problems that are there with Freud's account. So I define an uncanny experience as follows. So something is experienced as uncanny just in case it's, firstly, it is experienced as a concrete object or event. So this picks up on Freud's observation that the thing has to actually happen. Now notice here that this doesn't mean that the thing actually has to exist, right? So I might be hallucinating, maybe it's a phantom limb. I guess phantom limbs could be uncanny, but that doesn't mean that they exist, but you experience them as something concrete. The second condition is that the thing has to appear to be impossible, right? It has to be, it has to contradict what you believe to be possible in reality. And this combination of being experienced as real, but also appearing to be impossible, causes uncertainty about what is real. And this uncertainty, in turn, causes the objects to be evaluated as a threat, right? So it poses a threat to your grasp of reality. So that's the account of the uncanny that I've offered, developing aspects of Freud's account, so inspired by Freud's account. So in sum, this is it. The uncanny is an anxious uncertainty about what is real, caused by an apparent impossibility. So the aim here is that it can accommodate these cases which don't really have anything obvious to do with the supernatural. So waxwork figures, automata, dolls, these kinds of things. So the apparent impossibility here is that, well, it appears to be both human and non-human, animate and inanimate. It appears to be alive, but not. And that this causes a kind of this psychical uncertainty about what's real, right? It's kind of unsettling. So this is going on at quite a kind of low, in the back of your mind, so to speak. But it can also accommodate cases which are more obviously to do with the supernatural, such as the crying Madonna of Syracuse, right? So this might give you a much higher order uncertainty about what's real, because maybe upon seeing the crying statue, you really start to question whether this is an event caused by a supernatural being. So now I'm in a position to offer the contrast and the comparison between the two kinds of phenomena. So recapitulating what I laid out on the earlier slides, they both involve apparent impossibilities. They both involve violations of the natural order. But what distinguishes the miraculous and the uncanny at root are the subject's background beliefs about what is possible. So I should say the experience of the miraculous and the uncanny. Specifically, belief about the existence of the supernatural and whether it can interact in the ordinary course of events. Now, as an aside, if I'm on the right lines here, this looks like it puts pressure on Rudolf Otto's idea that there's a qualitatively distinctive kind of religious feeling, right? Rather, it seems that the feeling is dependent on how something is interpreted, on a cognitive appraisal. So here's final contrast I'll draw. Uncanny phenomena I observed earlier are primarily associated with negative feelings, so with fear and anxiety. And this follows from the fact that uncanny phenomena are threatening, right? They pose this psychological threat to us, and in particular, threaten our kind of grasp of reality. But perhaps they can also arouse positive responses or feelings, so in particular, curiosity and interest. On the other hand, miracles affirm an individual's religious worldview, hence the dominantly positive feeling. But as Otto highlighted, it seems like these religious feelings can also involve negative feelings, right? And I guess that's because there's a presence of something that's immeasurably great, incomprehensible, and in that sense, terrible. So how are we doing? Yeah, so I had a final example just to kind of illustrate the relevance of background beliefs. Filippo, yeah, shall I? I mean, it's just a kind of fun story. So really the main thrust of this talk has been that these experiences are dependent on an individual's background beliefs, right? So here's an example that I think really nicely illustrates how the same phenomenon can be uncanny to one person, but not to another person, depending on their different background beliefs and depending on the way they interpret the event. So the story, aptly enough, involves Freud himself, and the story can be found in Carl Jung's autobiography. So Freud was the one-time mentor of Jung, as many of you will know. And in the autobiography, Jung recounts a meeting that took place between him and Freud in 1909 in Vienna. And significantly, it was the final meeting between them before they parted ways, professionally. They had kind of an increasing divergence of views, right, in terms of psychoanalytic theory, including views about paranormal phenomena, which is what this story has to do with. So during the meeting, Jung asked Freud for his views on precognition and on parapsychology in general. And Jung mentions here that Freud had this kind of very materialistic worldview, so he was not amenable to these kinds of phenomena. And then this is what happens. This is how Jung tells it, and it's just a great story. So while Freud was going on his way, I had a curious sensation. It was as if my diaphragm were made of iron and were becoming red hot, a glowing volt. And at that moment, there was such a loud report in the bookcase, which stood right next to us, that we both started up in alarm, fearing the thing was going to topple over on us. I said to Freud, that is an example of a so-called catalytic exteriorization phenomenon. Oh, come, he explained, that is sheer bosh. That's Freud, by the way. It is not, I replied. You are mistaken, Herr Professor. And to prove my point, I now predict that in a moment there will be another such loud report. Sure enough, no sooner had I said the words than the same detonation went off in the bookcase. To this day, I do not know what gave me this certainty, but I knew beyond all doubt that the report would come again. Freud only stared aghast at me. I do not know what was in his mind or what his look meant. In any case, this incident had aroused his mistrust of me, and I had the feeling that I'd done something against him. Now, what's even more curious about this episode is that Freud writes a letter to Jung after the event. And the tone of the letter is, well, it's almost like a parody. He warns Jung that Jung needs to keep a cool head. He says, so Freud has made some investigations of the bookcase, and there's nothing weird going on at all. He tries to assure Jung, but it's really obvious that the event really did rile him at the time. So in the letter, Freud writes, "My credulity, or at least my readiness to believe, vanished along with the spell of your personal presence. Once again, for various inner reasons, it seems to me wholly implausible that anything of the sort should occur. The furniture stands before me spiritless and dead, like nature silent and godless before the poets after the passing of the gods of Greece." So Freud basically admits that at the time that this happened, that he was in this state of uncertainty, right, about what was really going on. And I think this just really beautifully illustrates Freud's own theory of the uncanny. And in the letter to Jung, he even goes on to talk about previous experience with recurring numbers, right, which is one of his own examples of the uncanny. Yeah, so the final thing I mentioned now, just as a kind of an avenue to explore further, is thinking about this example of Jung. So Jung, interestingly, talked about these kinds of phenomena in his work on synchronicity. So this refers to a lecture, and he later published a book called Synchronicity and a Causal Connecting Principle. And it's a theory that develops on psychic research that was being done at the time. So it was a burgeoning field at the time, and since died a death, academic study into psychical research. But also on quantum mechanics. So Jung describes a synchronicity as a meaningful coincidence of two or more events where something other than probability and the probability of chance is involved. Now, part of what it is to experience a synchronicity, Jung describes, is to have this feeling of the numinous, right? So he takes this word from Rudolf Otto, the theologian, coins this word as a neologism, and then Jung picks up on this word to describe this kind of affect that he associates with synchronicities. So we're coming full circle now, back to early on. But curious for Jung, these synchronicities are part of the natural order of the world, it seems. So he describes these acausal phenomena, which curiously he says otherwise called miracles, appear possible. As acausal events, they form an element that is part of the scientific picture of the world. It seems fairly clear to me that Jung's using the word miracle in a kind of loose or extended sense here. Can one really have a miracle if nature is all there is? Well, Spinoza was, quite clear. He was like, no, we can't. Miracles. The only really good sense we can make of a miracle is some interference of the supernatural and natural, it seems. Otherwise, the concept kind of just loses all its blood. In my view, there are others that would disagree, but Jung's choice of choosing the word numinous, picking up from Otto, does kind of raise the question on the possibility of, well, even if we discount the possibility of the supernatural, maybe we can still have this kind of affect, this emotion of the numen, right, of the spiritual or the divine. So I'm just flagging this up as a kind of an avenue for further investigation. Okay, that's it.